With every strong opening and grand finale in a story, there must always come the less exciting content that lies in between, the filler. Functionally, filler serves to extend the time of a novel, film, or video game in order to make the package as a whole feel more complete and worth its price point. However, on a narrative level, filler helps to lower the tension of a story and act as a palate cleanser for the audience. It gives them a break from the high stakes of the main story and allows the audience to sit back and enjoy a simpler, more self-contained tale for a brief time. Filler is incredibly important to get right, because getting it wrong can risk making a story feel as if it's dragging on for too long. But getting it right can create some of the most memorable and enjoyable moments within the greater story as a whole. When it comes to Ace Attorney, filler cases are interesting to take a look at because they mark the times when the developers are allowed to be as creative as possible. It's during these cases in particular that the series explores its most outlandish and unique concepts, which ends up leading to varying degrees of success. After all, every attempt to try something new comes with the risk of standing out in a negative way rather than a positive way. And each and every player's mileage will vary from case to case. As a result of this varying level of quality, Ace Attorney's filler cases are a frequent topic of discussion in the community. They've garnered a poor reputation over the years due to some of the series' worst cases of all time being filler cases. And I certainly won't argue that this reputation is unearned. Yet at the same time, many of the more recent filler cases in the series actually end up being some of the best cases in their respective games, which is the exact inverse of what they were once known to be. This makes the history of Ace Attorney's filler cases quite interesting because it contains some of the lowest lows and some of the highest highs in the series. And that provides a lot of information regarding what works and what doesn't when it comes to creating one. Today, I wanted to take a look at Ace Attorney's long history of filler cases in order to determine what makes an infamous case, what makes a fun case, and what makes a filler case worth standing side by side with some of the all-time greats. Let's begin. Anyone who has spent a decent amount of time in the Ace Attorney community should be familiar with the term third case syndrome. But in case you're not, the term refers to the fact that the third case in any given Ace Attorney game is typically of significantly lower quality than any other case in that game. While this certainly isn't the case for several Ace Attorney games, as we will see later, there are 3 cases from throughout the series that I feel justify the existence of this term the most. Those being Turnabout Big Top, Turnabout Serenade, and the Kidnap Turnabout. These 3 fail as Ace Attorney cases in practically every way, making them perfect showcases of how a filler case can go horribly wrong. But I think I've managed to narrow down their flaws to just 3 major factors, those being their characters, pacing, and logic. First off, let's discuss characters. To get straight to the point, the original characters of all 3 of these cases are wholly unlikable. Characters like Turnabout Serenade's Darren Crescent and the Kidnap Turnabout's Lance Amano range from completely unnoteworthy to straight up insufferable, with the former being an otherwise completely unmemorable villain that is made significantly worse by the case surrounding him, and with the latter being an obnoxious brat who actively brings down his respective case. However, I think that Turnabout Big Top is the biggest loser in this particular category. From Max Galactica to Mo the Clown to Ben and Trilo to Regina Berry, this entire cast is filled with selfish, obnoxious jerks who are all granted their chance to leave a bad impression on the player. As I have discussed in several videos, characters have the ability to make or break a story, especially when it comes to Ace Attorney. So when a case's characters only serve to drag a case down, then the case itself really struggles to leave a positive impression. Next up is pacing, which is all over the place in these cases. When it comes to Turnabout Big Top, players need look no further for an example of bad pacing than Mo and his 5 whole testimonies, which brings the case to a screeching halt and kills any and all momentum that it may or may not have previously had. This section frustrates me because it feels as if it was designed purely to annoy the player, and if that was the case, then mission accomplished. The case makes an entire mechanic around being careful when pressing Mo's statements, because pressing the wrong one will result in a bad joke and a penalty. Restricting pressing in order to raise the difficulty is a concept that has been done right in the series, but this isn't how to do it because it comes off as more of a nuisance than an interesting mechanic. Turnabout Serenade is able to one-up its predecessor by introducing the Guitar Serenade music video, which is played a grand total of way too many times throughout the case. And each and every time feels like another year taken off of my life. Turnabout Serenade as a whole really struggles to get to the point, though that is more of an Apollo Justice Ace Attorney issue than a Serenade exclusive issue. But despite that, this godforsaken video definitely takes the cake when it comes to interruptive pace breakers in that game. Though the constant references to 7 years ago and these stupid cards definitely makes for a very close second. However, I'm gonna have to shine the spotlight of shame on the Kidnap Turnabout this time around. Players are forced to spend hours darting around Gatewater Land without feeling any real sense of direction, making them wonder why they're even doing what they are in the first place. The Kidnap Turnabout as a whole feels like it isn't necessarily sure what it wants to be, and while it experiences its identity crisis, the player is left to be strung along while they just wait for it to end already. Ace Attorney Investigations' Miles Edgeworth as a whole tends to struggle when it comes to pacing. But with the exception of He Who Will Not Be Named, I believe that the Kidnap Turnabout marks when the game is at its worst in this regard. Finally, we have Logic, which, like the other things that I've discussed, is a place where these cases fall flat on their faces. It may feel silly to criticize the logic of any given case from a series that has become widely well known for its comedically illogical scenarios, but the fact of the matter is that Ace Attorney is generally able to strike a very fine balance between the illogical and the logical in order to create an engaging, immersive story in spite of its unrealistic elements. This does, however, mean that players are very much expected to utilize their suspension of disbelief, which refers to when they must disregard logical fallacies within a story for the sake of enjoying it. The player's suspension of disbelief is something that Ace Attorney's developers constantly have to keep in mind when writing a case, as they can expect players to use it to a degree, but push things too far, and they risk breaking their immersion, not only making a particular fault feel especially apparent, but making players more likely to notice other, more minor faults that they otherwise wouldn't. And as I'm sure you can guess, the 3 cases that I previously mentioned all do exactly this, as they are all illogical messes with very hard to believe and hard to follow logic that feels more dumb and frustrating than well written and cleverly implemented. In Turnabout Big Top's case, there is no better example than the infamous reveal that Max Galactica's cape flew onto the bus depicting him in order to create the illusion that he was at the scene of the crime. Not only does this feel incredibly hard to believe, but it's so specific that the player is likely unable to come to such a conclusion themselves, which just makes the reveal as a whole feel underwhelming and unsatisfying. A good revelation is one that makes the audience feel stupid for not realizing it themselves sooner. But this infamous moment in Turnabout Big Top does exactly the opposite by just making them more confused than they already were. The Kidnap Turnabout feels like it doesn't make sense from beginning to end, as players don't even know what they're really supposed to be investigating for the majority of it. As soon as they are able to determine that the murder that they still know very little about took place in the haunted house in Gatewater Land, Ernest Amano interrupts to announce that he is now the legal owner of the haunted house, and that he forbids anyone from entering it to investigate. This reveal isn't necessarily illogical in-universe, as it does feel realistic that Ernest Amano would think this far in advance, but it certainly does feel out of nowhere from a narrative perspective. Seeing as the player's been spending the entire case just trying to make some sort of progress, it just feels unnecessary and even maddening to receive yet another roadblock in such a sudden fashion. However, Turnabout Serenade is the worst offender of them all in this category. The entire case is built upon Machi Tobai, a 14-year-old boy, using a murder weapon that would severely damage his arm to fire and carrying a dead body that is triple his size. These completely nonsensical facts are never once addressed throughout the case itself, making the case feel flawed on a foundational level. But players are simply expected to go along with it by utilizing their suspension of disbelief. And unfortunately, this trend of making players simply go along with things that don't really make any sense continues throughout the rest of the case. From both Machi and Lamiwar lying about both their ability to see and their ability to speak English, to Lamiwar apparently viewing the crime from the vents, to smuggling a Borginian cocoon by hiding it inside of a guitar, Turnabout Serenade is full of questionable revelations that the player is expected to simply go along with. Needless to say, this all adds up over time, and combines to make a case that is miserable to trudge through from beginning to end. It's simply too much for my own suspension of disbelief to handle. And as I said, that ends up taking me out of the game and preventing me from enjoying it whatsoever. However, every player is bound to have a different limit. So what may be too much for me may be fine for a different player. But at least for me personally, Turnabout Serenade is an absolutely insufferable case due to its very poorly written logic. Overall, these three cases fail in all of the major ways that they could have, making them all slogs to get through and leaving a bad taste in the players' mouths when all is said and done. As filler cases, they add nothing to their respective games in spite of the fact that they attempt to do so at times, and they are completely unfun cases to play through due to their dreadful pacing, unlikable casts, and ridiculous plot points. While the previous three cases that I discussed showed how a poorly done filler case can feel as if it's dragging on for far too long, the cases that I have to discuss here, those being the Stolen Turnabout, Recipe for Turnabout, and Turnabout Reclaimed, show how a filler case can be fun and memorable if done right. These cases are all very aware of their role as filler. So rather than try to avoid that fate, they embrace it by having as much fun with it as possible. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at each case conceptually and compare them to an average, more standard case. The Stolen Turnabout stands out by immediately being one of the only cases in the series to not initially involve a murder, as the case concerns a thievery at the hands of a mysterious Mask de Mask. Recipe for Turnabout involves an impersonator of Phoenix Wright using his likeness to net someone a guilty verdict, leaving Phoenix to deal with the aftermath of that disaster a month later. And last but certainly not least, Turnabout Reclaimed involves Phoenix Wright defending an orca from murder charges. Yes, you heard me right, an orca. As I'm sure you noticed, all three of these cases contain scenarios that are far different from a simple murder mystery, and they range from unique to completely off the walls insane. However, it's important to note that being unique does not automatically guarantee success. After all, the previous three cases that I discussed could all certainly be described as unique in their own ways, but that uniqueness was not helpful at best and detrimental at worst. Thankfully, I believe that all of the cases here were able to do their goofy concepts justice. The Stolen Turnabout comes off as a fairly standard case at first, as Phoenix Wright is able to determine that the pompous detective Luke Atmey is the true identity of Mask de Mask, as opposed to Phoenix's bumbling buffoon of a client who swears that he is the true thief, Ron Delight. However, as soon as the trial concerning the thievery wraps up, Ron Delight is immediately accused of committing murder purely because of the fact that his alibi in the former made him a prime suspect in the latter. This puts a very interesting spin on things, because Phoenix and the player must now find a way to win their client's innocence without arguing against the court's previous decision that they helped to determine. And things are made even more complex when it's revealed that Luke Atmey is the true murderer of the case, and that he willingly accepted the thievery charges in order to win himself a lesser sentence. This wholly unique scenario is used to excellent effect because it raises the stakes and forces the player to consider factors that they had previously not needed to consider, making for an incredibly engaging case that excels with what it's given. Recipe for Turnabout decides to take a slightly different approach by fully committing to comedy, and like its direct predecessor, it's able to excel in my eyes. The case ups the ridiculousness of its plot points up to 11, with the villain being a hot-headed loan shark with the exact same haircut as Phoenix Wright that apparently used a cardboard badge to impersonate him, which is the stupidest thing that I've ever heard, and I love it. Now don't get me wrong, I understand the fact that I sound like a massive hypocrite right now. After all, I criticized previous cases in this video for their faulty logic and ridiculous scenarios, so why would I be praising the same type of things here? Well, I think it mainly comes down to how those elements are presented to the player and the tone of the case itself. While the previous cases that I discussed took their ridiculous elements a tad too seriously and fully expected the player to go along with them as if it were any other case, Recipe for Turnabout knows exactly what it's doing, and it's proud of it, as it plays its ridiculousness up as much as possible in order to maximize its comedic effect, making for one of the most entertaining cases in the series. In a similar vein to that, Turnabout Reclaimed commits to the idea of implementing an orca into a murder case and uses that idea to make players consider the case from completely different angles. It does feel odd to call a DLC case filler, because it's entirely optional, and as such is not filling in any space. But I believe that it still fulfills the same purpose of a filler case on a narrative level as an extra story that doesn't pertain to the main plot. So I believe that it still qualifies for this video. Turnabout Reclaimed is fascinating to me because in a way, it actually takes a note out of both the Stolen Turnabout and Recipe for Turnabout's books, as it borrows the stake-raising two-act structure of the former and the silliness from the latter. Like in the Stolen Turnabout, the seemingly simple conclusion of the first trial actually results in a much more intense second trial, as clearing Orla the Orca's name actually ends up opening the door for the indictment of Sasha Buckler, which is ironic seeing as she's the one who asked Phoenix to defend Orla to begin with. This allows the case to take a much more serious and emotionally rich turn as it explores characters like Sasha Buckler, Herman Crab, and Marlon Rimes, all while being occasionally interrupted to remind players that the entire premise of this case is absolutely absurd. And that actually leads me to my next point about these three cases. While they all thrive on comedy to a degree, none of them hesitate to have more dark and serious moments, allowing them to feel rich and complex in spite of their goofy exteriors. Luke Atmey is a very entertaining villain due to his over-the-top personality and design, but he's also a genuinely conniving, sinister genius who managed to manipulate Ron DeLite into doing his dirty work, and who very nearly got away with his biggest crime due to his initial sentence. Irio Tigre's existence is ludicrous in and of itself, but his past and connections to Viola Cadaverini is genuinely tragic, which, while not nearly enough to redeem the man, adds a lot of emotional depth to his relationship with Viola herself as she struggles to accept the fact that he only cares for her out of obligation. And Marlon Rimes is a villain so tragic that I discussed his story in depth in a video covering Ace Attorney's most tragic villains. But to summarize what I said in that video, his role as a villain comes as quite a surprise. And the fact that the death of the victim was merely an accident caused from him attempting to avenge his girlfriend is genuinely heart-wrenching. All of these cases manage to perfectly strike a balance between laughs and seriousness in order to maximize both fun and impact, making them polar opposites of the cases I previously discussed. Despite the fact that the Stolen Turnabout, Recipe for Turnabout, and Turnabout Reclaimed all function as filler cases, they do everything a well-written Ace Attorney case ought to. They tackle unique concepts that had not been done before in order to stand out, and blend comedy with authenticity in order to cement themselves as some of the better cases in the series. Now, I'll admit, the final three cases that I have to discuss in this video, those being Turnabout Academy, Turnabout Legacy, and the Return of the Great Departed Soul, hardly qualify as filler cases because they are significantly more important to their respective games' overall stories than any other case in this video. But I believe that fact in and of itself is interesting enough to warrant exploring them here. Rather than make the most out of being filler, these three cases make a real effort to connect to the overarching plot. Furthermore, they are vital to their respective protagonists' character development, making them all nearly as important as some final cases. Yet despite that, all three of them don't appear to be nearly as important as they would go on to be at first glance. Instead, they disguise themselves as insignificant filler cases in order to lead the player into a false sense of security before peeling back the layers and exposing them to the complexity that lies beneath the surface. I'll be the first to admit that Turnabout Academy doesn't quite sit on the same pedestal as the other two cases that I've chosen for this section, but I believe that it's still a remarkably solid case that still manages to demonstrate the point that I'm trying to make. I acknowledge that the adventure of the runaway room could have taken its place in this video, but even I struggled to justify labeling a case like that as filler with any argument other than, it's the third case in the game, therefore it's a filler case. If you're interested in my thoughts on that case, then I've already discussed several elements from it in some of my other videos, so I would recommend checking those out. For now though, back to Turnabout Academy. On the surface, the case seems to fulfill the role of a fairly standard filler case, with the unique university setting being what sets it apart. But what makes it really stand out is its protagonist, Athena Sykes, and the expansion of the Dark Age of the Law. Both of these elements are things that were previously introduced to the player, but it's here where they are really fleshed out, which then transitions fairly smoothly into the two-part finale that follows. After being immediately sidelined by Phoenix and Apollo in the previous two cases, Athena really gets to come to her own in Turnabout Academy, with players getting to see her overcoming her fears through nothing but her conviction and determination, showing how she's just as good of a defense attorney as anyone that came before her. The case as a whole has a much more whimsical and slightly unhinged feel to it with Athena at the helm, really allowing her to stand out as a character. I don't think there are any other defense attorneys in the franchise who have their associates tie them up in various poses all for the sake of demonstrating a point. Similarly, the Dark Age of the Law is something that had been hinted towards previously, but Turnabout Academy is where the concept is fully brought to light. And while I will admit that the idea is bashed over the player's head a few too many times, I can't deny that I was very intrigued by it, and the duality that it created between Athena and the case's main villain, Aristotle Means, is pretty well done in my opinion. However, Turnabout Academy still pales in comparison to Turnabout Legacy, which, like the former, can seem like a completely irrelevant filler case at first. A case centralized around a popular in-universe show sounds like a prime candidate for some throwaway filler, especially when considering the fact that that idea has already been done several times before. But before the case's introduction even concludes, the importance of Turnabout Legacy quickly becomes clear. In reality, this case covers the very incident that would go on to lead to the DL6 incident, which is debatably the single most important event in the entire franchise, especially for the game's protagonist, Miles Edgeworth. And sure enough, Turnabout Legacy, in spite of its fillery sweet exterior, is one of the most important cases not only in Investigations 2, but in the greater series as a whole, as it not only involves finally incarcerating the man responsible for the entire series once and for all, but its missing threads would go on to form the backbone of one of the most legendary finales in the series. It's interesting because if you remove this case's connections to DL6, what's left is a fairly standard run-of-the-mill filler case. But the devs decided to take things a step further and implement those connections in order to construct a case that stands side by side with some of the final cases due to the gravity and overall impact of its events. And speaking of cases that could act as finales all on their own, The Return of the Great Departed Soul is a legendary case with grandeur that surpasses some finales from other Ace Attorney games in the series. Like the two cases that I discussed previously, this case starts out feeling as fillery as ever, this time with a scientific twist, allowing for some interesting investigations and deductions involving machinery and creating some conflict between Ryunosuke Naruhodo and his client due to that client wanting to protect his own creation more than his own innocence. However, before the first trial begins, Herlock Sholmes informs Ryunosuke and Susato of a waxwork museum run by Madame Tussbells. And this seemingly random location would end up expanding the case's complexity tenfold, as it later uses this waxwork museum to delve into the story of an infamous mass murderer known as the Professor. From there, the case as a whole quickly expands into a greater narrative filled with mysterious, dark events of the past that previous cases dared not to explore, including in a mind-blowing final cutscene that promises to reach even greater heights in the grand finale that is to follow. This case had me glued to my screen because the way that it enriches the overarching story of the great Ace Attorney duology made for one of the most engaging experiences in the series. And its willingness to go where no case had previously gone made an otherwise decent case into a real sight to behold. I couldn't help but notice the fact that a large majority of my videos end up discussing Investigations 2, The Great Ace Attorney 2, or both. But can you really blame me? Not my fault that these two games almost always offer up the best examples of every topic that I discuss, but I digress. Regardless, all three of these cases are fascinating to me because they ascend far beyond what they otherwise would have been without their added complexity. Yet they're still able to utilize the strengths that a filler case can have. As I stated, these cases all bring something unique to the table, allowing them to stand out in their own interesting ways and making them just as fun as some of the cases that I discussed previously. And I think that's what makes Turnabout Academy, Turnabout Legacy, and The Return of the Great Departed Soul stand out as truly exceptional Ace Attorney cases. They're the best of both worlds. By utilizing the unique fun that can come with a good filler case and combining it with the layered complexity of some of Ace Attorney's finest cases, these three stand out for being about as far away from what cemented the idea of third case syndrome as they could possibly be. Hey, thanks for watching the video. Be sure to let me know what your favorite filler case from the Ace Attorney series is down in the comments below. And while you're down there, consider hitting the subscribe button for more deep dives into all things Ace Attorney. For now though, that's all from me. Take care of yourselves.